What's one of the big moral claims of the West? The abolition of slavery, right? They say, we abolish slavery while you Muslims still have slavery in your laws until today. Okay, let's be honest. In reality, there are more slaves today than there ever have been. Why? Because power in the US and Europe and elsewhere in the West, throughout the West, power never makes a decision for moral reasons, but only for financial reasons. Now, those financial reasons may coincide with moral reasons, but that's accidental. And that's the case with slavery. When the moral reasons coincide with the financial reasons, then that just gives you a moral rationale for what is actually a strictly financial decision, to make it look like you're altruistic. But nothing could be further from the truth. The Emancipation Proclamation took place during the Civil War, not before it. It didn't cause the Civil War. It was just an economic weapon by the North against the South during the war. That wasn't a morally driven decision, but it allowed them to package their cause as a moral one, and they've been packaging it like that ever since. Because the truth of the matter is, you didn't abolish slavery, you deregulated it. You know, some historians estimate that up to as much as 90% of the profits that were generated from slave labor ended up being spent on the slaves themselves, on some plantations. Not all of them, but some, spending on their food, their shelter, their clothing, their medical care, and so on, because it was in the interest of slave owners to maintain a slave's physical well-being to one extent or another, because it was expensive to buy a slave, and it's expensive to keep a slave. But you don't have to spend any of that money on a wage slave. You don't have to buy their food, you don't have to buy their clothing, you don't have to pay for their health care, you don't have to pay for their accommodation and so on. They have to pay for all of that from the little bit of money that you give them to rent their labor. It makes financial sense. It's a lot cheaper to rent someone than to buy them. That's deregulation. That's not abolition. You know, a significant portion of former slaves continued to work on the same plantations that they had been working on before emancipation. But now they were responsible for all their own expenses. And many of them, as a result of that, paying for their own health care, their own housing, food, clothing, and so on, they became debt slaves. So they were debt slaves as well as wage slaves. And you all found that model so successful and so lucrative that you expanded it to other sectors, like to the coal miners. Well, that's nothing but deregulated slavery. And you had established such a standard of brutality and inhumanity towards slaves that it put workers' rights in such a hole to where they had to fight tooth and nail just for basic decency, because they were all nothing but deregulated slaves. Oh, it was a genius move. And then, of course, you went around the world on your so-called moral crusade to abolish or to deregulate slavery everywhere, as if anyone in the world had been as savage as you in the practice of slavery. In the Muslim world, slaves were more like proteges, more like wards. The Arabic word that was traditionally used for a slave owner linguistically had the connotation of custodian or caretaker or someone who is responsible for someone else. Slaves had the right to purchase their way out of servitude, and they had the freedom to pursue earning independent income. Well, there were some slaves in the Muslim world who had more money than their masters. There were slaves in the Muslim world who held high positions in the government. They weren't treated as subhuman. Slavery in the Muslim world wasn't based on race or ethnicity. There wasn't some sick quasi-scientific rationale claiming that they were inferior human beings. That's unique to American slavery. In Islam, slaves could register cases against their master in court. Slaves in the Muslim world had more rights and more upward mobility than freed slaves in America. Why, they had more rights and more upward mobility than many African Americans have in the US right now. Because we never approached this institution the way you approached that institution. We didn't do it the way you did it. A slave in Islam has to have the same material lifestyle as his master. He can't be overworked and he can't be abused. And if he is, he has legal recourse. So when you went around the world telling everyone how evil slavery is, they didn't know what you were talking about. The slaves didn't know what you were talking about because they had not experienced your form of slavery. They had not experienced American slavery. Look, slavery is something that has always existed and it still exists today. But like with everything else that is part of the human condition, Islam regulated it to ensure that it was practiced morally and humanely, because we know that when you deregulate it the way that you did, it's not going to stop it. It's just going to make it even more inhumane and more exploitative than it was before. And that's exactly what you did. Like I said, you have more slaves now than at any time in human history, and the United States is the top destination for human trafficking, especially for children and for women. So you need to stop bragging about abolition. You didn't abolish anything. You just made slavery even more lucrative and more brutal than you had already made it. And nobody practiced a more brutal form of slavery than you. Now look around your cities. Look at San Francisco. Look at Detroit. Look at the homelessness epidemic that you have. Imagine if those people had the option to be taken in, to be taken under the wing of more well-off people, people who would share their homes, share their clothes, share their food, pay all their expenses, take care of their health, look after them, teach them skills, give them training and education, give them a job that would have even less restrictions on their rights and their freedom than someone working today at Amazon or Walmart. Because that's what slavery was in Islam. That's what regulated slavery looks like. Taking in the most vulnerable, economically deprived people who are going to exist anyway, especially in your system, and actually taking care of them. Yes, they would be legally bound to that person, but that bond goes both ways. There's a reason why slavery has always existed in human societies, and it's not because human beings are just barbaric and savage and cruel. Just because that's the way you did it, just because that's what you made slavery mean, it didn't always mean that, and it wasn't always practiced that way. It wasn't always practiced the way that you practiced it. It always has existed in human society because there were always going to be people in society who are especially vulnerable and down and out, and they can't just be trampled on and used and abused. Their situation, their condition, their circumstances have to be regulated, and the way people deal with them has to be regulated, and the way to regulate that is to have them connected to someone in society who isn't down and out. They have to be connected to someone in society who isn't deprived and vulnerable. They have to be connected to someone who can take care of them. And from that connection, they can get respect and they can get opportunities and they can move up and on in life. That's the way it was practiced in Islam. Completely polar opposite to the way it was practiced in the United States, where if you were a slave, you were going to always be a slave and you were treated like a beast of burden. That's the way you practiced it, but that's not the way we practiced it. When I'm talking positively about slavery, you will infer from that I'm talking positively about the way you practice slavery. But let me be clear. There's nothing to say about the way you practice slavery except the strongest possible condemnation. But the way it was practiced in Islam, there's nothing wrong with it at all. Not a thing wrong with it. So look, I don't have any hesitation about this issue, and no Muslim should. You can't make me flinch by talking about slavery. Just like with everything else, Islam came and regulated what is a constant reality of the human condition to make it moral. We don't pretend that it's something that you can get rid of. There's always going to be vulnerable people. There's always going to be people who are subject to exploitation. You can't get rid of it, and you didn't get rid of it. All you did was make it worse. And somehow, because perception is reality in your culture, you get to pretend like you did something good. Well, tell that to the 20 to 30,000 women and children that you traffic every year in the West. You want to pretend that your form of slavery was everyone's form of slavery. And you like to talk about the Arab-African slave trade as if it bears any resemblance to the transatlantic slave trade. Well, it doesn't. Yes, there were African slaves in the Muslim world. African slaves who were enslaved in Africa by Africans and sold to the Muslim world, along with Europeans, along with Arabs, along with Persians, and plenty of other ethnicities. And none of them were treated as subhuman. None of them were regarded as less than human. And many of them went on to achieve high positions in Muslim society, positions of high respect and influence. And if you want to bring up eunuchs and castration, yes, that's a thing that happened. And it happened en route before they reached Muslim lands, because it was illegal to do that to someone in Muslim jurisdiction. Not like you. You used to castrate young boys just because you liked the way it made them sound when they sing in church. No, you're in no position to moralize on this issue. Your perception is not our reality. We can see the way things really are. We can see what you really did. We can see what you're really doing. And we know our own history and we know yours.